Welcome to today's Festival of Ideas Focus Day on global security in a year of elections. My name is Matt Matravers. I'm the director of the Morrell Center for Legal and Political Philosophy, which, through the generosity of the C&JB Morrell Trust, sponsors today. So I'd like to just start with 3 words of thanks, and then I'm going to say something about what's not in the program, and then something about what is in the program for the day. So my thanks go to the C&JB Morrell Trust and the trustees who are here, to the festival events team who do such a fantastic job of putting this all together, and of course to the speakers for the day. We have 3 tremendous panels of people who are very important and very busy and voluntarily give up their time to come and do this, and I'm immensely grateful to them. So those are my 4 words of thanks. Let me just say something about what's not on the program and then something about the day. Some of you may be a bit surprised that what's not on the program, at least directly, is what's happening in Gaza. The explanation, and I'm sure it will come up, one can't talk about global security without talking about these things, but I thought it was worth raising because we did a focus day a couple of years ago, and given the recidivist nature of festival audiences, I'm sure some of you would have been there, on the Oslo Accords and on the possibilities of peace in the Middle East. And so when the events team and I met in, I think it was early December, to discuss this year's focus day, it wasn't really on the cards to revisit that. We'd done it so recently. And rather, as it turns out, rather horrifically, I remember sitting in Joan's office in the basement of Heslington Hall and saying, and surely, for heaven's sake, what's happening in Gaza will be over by next summer. It is obviously tragic that it's not over, but if you're thinking about it, I just thought I'd fill you in, as it were, on how we got to where we've got to. So what is on the program? Much more exciting. Well, our lens is that, as many of you will know, this calendar year, more than half the world's population are going to vote in elections of one kind or another, some free and fair, some less free and fair, but many billions of people are voting or have voted this year. And what we wanted to do was to frame the day through the lens of that. And we are starting with a panel on global security in the year of elections, looking at particularly, what would the implications be of a Trump presidency, but in general, what's the sort of state of the global situation in terms of safety and security. So that's the morning session. In the afternoon session at 1:30 or so in here, we're going to be looking at the rise of the global south. One of the most interesting features of the kind of post-Cold War world is the way in which countries no longer belong to domains of the USSR or the United States, and India, South Africa, both of which have had very recent elections, and other countries have been pushing themselves forward as leading global players. So our second panel looks at that. Our third panel, also an absolutely wonderful panel of experts, is looking at the question of, well, look, if elections matter so much, then how do we know that they're secure? We know that there are problems with fake digital fakes. We know that there are problems with Russian bot farms. We know there are problems with lots of election interference. So how should we think about the security and stability of elections themselves? But also, and finally, do elections really matter? If you look at Davos or if you look at the G7, what you notice behind all the politicians are all the global and multinational corporations. And so our third panel, which is at 3:30, again in here, looks at those 2 questions. Do elections matter? And if they matter, which I think they do, how should we think about their security? So that's the day, and that's enough from me. You're not here to listen to me, so I'll hand over to Gavin Esler. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming here this morning. It's good to see so many people. I'm going to introduce the panel in a moment and just do a short scene set, and then we'll get on with business. But one of the great things about British universities is, and York is a perfect example, is we are rooted in the community, in the wider community. But we're also rooted in the world, and that's why we've got experts from different parts of the world with different perspectives on our theme, global security in a year of elections. Let me begin by introducing the panel, as I said. Ambassador Stephen Pifer, among many other distinctions. Steve is a former US ambassador to Ukraine, a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Ambassador Pifer is also director of the Brookings Arms Control Initiative, a senior fellow at the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, and the Center on the United States and Europe. Next to me is Tracey German, who is Professor of Conflict and Security at King's College London and a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. Professor German's research focuses on Russian foreign and security policies, and we might discuss, I suspect, how far Russia is one of the world's worst neighbours at the moment. Mark Laity, next to me here. Mark is an expert on strategic communications and security, one of the leaders in its development within NATO. He's an esteemed former colleague of mine at the BBC, but we won't hold that against him. And among many distinctions, his service in Afghanistan was awarded the NATO's Meritorious Service Medal. More importantly, he was a student, a postgraduate, and an honorary doctor at one of the UK's great universities, which happens to be this one. And Dr. Helene von Bismarck was born in Brussels to German parents. She grew up in Russia, Germany, and Belgium. She has a PhD in modern history from Humboldt University, is an author, and among many other distinctions, Dr. von Bismarck is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a visiting research fellow at the Centre for British Politics and Government at King's College London. Those are our expert panel. And a quick word on our format. I'm going to ask each of them to do a short presentation. Then we'll have a conversation together. I'll bring in some questions from the audience, and we'll see where we go, finishing around 12:30. So let's begin with the good news. And the good news is that this year has seen the greatest ever experiment in democracy in history. Almost 1 billion voters were eligible to vote in India's election. Now, whatever you think of the result, it is an extraordinary experience to see what has been going on there. But there are many, many other problems, and the panels this afternoon may get on to some of those too directly. Chinese interference in the Taiwan elections verged on what some people in Taiwan that I've spoken to said was bullying. There have been popular protests against the imposition of a Russian-inspired law in Georgia, and Georgia has suffered greatly as a result of the expansionism from the Kremlin. In European elections, we've heard of the rise of the right, the far right, extreme right. You can pick up your own description there. And the war continues, of course, in Ukraine, as well as what's going on between Gaza and Israel. There is also, and this perhaps overshadows many things, our thoughts about the destruction derby known as the US presidential elections, which could see the former president of the United States return to the White House. He will return to the courthouse. He could even end up in the jailhouse. So this obviously has certain implications for all of us, it seems to me. And here at home, the former UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, an estimable figure in my opinion, said that the cutbacks to the British Army, back to the level something of about 1815, I've looked at the figures, I think they go back to the levels of 1715 and the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. Mr. Wallace said, if we want the army just to tootle around at home, we've got enough. So we may all have our problems. So that's enough from me. Let's set the scene with each of our guests. Steve, maybe you'd like to begin for us, please.
Well, thank you, Gavin, and thank you also to the festival organizers for inviting me. We have an election in America in November, and I think it's going to have huge implications for Europe. Let me be clear first about some of my biases. I did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016 or in 2020. I will not vote him this year. I think his return to the White House would be very damaging both for American democracy, but also for American foreign policy. A second bias is, by experience and expertise, I tend to be a Europeanist, but I will agree with my colleagues who say that the major strategic challenge confronting the United States today is the rise of China as a superpower. Nevertheless, I think the urgent strategic challenge is how do you deal with Russia? And it's from the perspective, really for 7 decades, American leaders have defined a stable and secure Europe as a vital American national interest. If Russia wins in Ukraine, Europe's going to be less stable, less secure, and I think facing a greater threat. Now, would Vladimir Putin, emboldened by a victory in Ukraine, then be tempted to take on a NATO country, say in the Baltics? Most experts out there now would say, not at all, no chance. But most experts 5 years ago would not have predicted what Vladimir Putin did in 2022 when he launched what has now become the bloodiest war that Europe has seen since World War II. So I think there's a certain risk in underestimating Mr. Putin's ambitions. Now, how our election turns out, I think between a second Biden administration or a second Trump administration is going to have very different implications for American policy in Europe. President Biden is a transatlanticist. He understands the value of allies and alliances. I think he's also pretty clear-eyed on Russia. When he came to the White House, he came as president in 2021, he wasn't talking about reset. He wasn't talking about cooperation, but they set the modest goal of more stability, more predictability in relations between Washington and Moscow. And when the US intelligence community assessed that Russia was likely to launch a major invasion, the Biden administration engaged in a very proactive way, working with allies, primarily here in Europe, so that once that invasion began, there was a very quick reaction in terms of sanctions on Russia, weapons flows to the Ukrainians, and steps to bolster NATO's eastern flank. And really from that time, the Biden administration has said they have two goals: help Ukraine and avoid a NATO-Russia military clash. And those are the right two goals. I guess, though, where I would be a bit critical of the Biden administration is that in balancing those goals, they've been a bit more timid than they need be. Now, part of this is driven by a concern of avoiding a wider war. The Russians have tried to play the nuclear card. I'm not sure exactly what they have stopped. I mean, one could say they have deterred the involvement of NATO combat forces in the fight, but I'm not sure that that was an offer in any case. And what they have done is perhaps slowed the flow of Western weapons to Ukraine, but they haven't stopped it. Ukrainians now have long-range ATACMS missiles. They'll be getting F-16s later on this year. And you've seen over the last weeks that restrictions on their use of those weapons against Russia have been gradually lifted. Now, I would like to see the Biden administration be a bit more bolder. It would be in terms of really defining an explicit goal, which would be Ukraine prevailing. It would be more arms to Ukraine, and it would be removal of the existing sanctions on Ukraine's ability to use American weapons to strike military targets in Russia. But if President Biden wins in November, which I fervently hope that he will, I would expect you would see a lot of continuity in American policy. The Biden administration in 2025 would be inclined to continue support for Ukraine, and I believe they could successfully work with Congress to secure additional funds. So we would be continuing not only political support, diplomatic support, but also providing the funds that would help Ukraine sustain its defense. And hopefully that prospect of continued American support for Ukraine, along with continued European support, might cause the Kremlin to begin to reassess what I think has turned out to be, thus far, a very costly war for Russia. I think the British Ministry of Defense estimate now is 500,000 Russians either killed in action or seriously wounded. The costs are mounting. Now, at the same time, in that second administration, while President Biden would continue to support Ukraine, I do believe he would look to Europe to begin to take up a larger part of the load, because China's still out there, and that still is a challenge that requires American attention. I believe if Trump is the president next January, you'll see a very different approach. Now, some people look at the first Trump administration, they say, well, look, in those 4 years, the United States increased sanctions on Russia, began providing lethal military assistance to Ukraine, and bolstered the American presence in NATO. And that happened, that was correct. I don't think that any of those actions really reflected Mr. Trump's own instincts. The US government is a pretty complex entity, and I don't think Mr. Trump understood how it works, or really understood how to take his ideas and translate them into policy. This is not a case of the deep state resisting the president, but it's more a case of career officials not understanding how you take a random tweet and make that American policy. And you also had a situation where the people that surrounded him, people like retired Generals Kelly, McMaster, Mattis, worked to soften, his worst impulses. If there's a second term, I think it's going to be very different. First of all, there are projects underway that are designed specifically to say, this is the instincts of Mr. Trump, this is how you make them policy. And they're coming up with lists of people that would implement that policy. And I'm pretty sure Kelly, McMaster, and Mattis are not going to be on that list. So you have to look at Trump's views, and I think those lead to some concern. First of all, here's somebody who seems to have a soft spot for authoritarianism and a specific affinity for Vladimir Putin. He's never criticized Putin or Russian actions. We saw, I think, one of the most awkward appearances by an American president overseas in 2018, where after a meeting with Mr. Putin in Helsinki, on a press conference, he sides with Mr. Putin against his own intelligence community. My colleague at Brookings, Fiona Hill, who was at the time the senior advisor to Trump on Russia, was in the audience, and she thought it was so bad, she was actually considering faking a medical emergency to end the conference. Trump has long been skeptical about NATO. That goes back 40 years. He looks at NATO, and in his view, it's basically the United States pays for defense, allies free ride, use their savings to compete or outcompete us in trade, and take American jobs. And he seems to look at NATO as something of a protection racket. If you pay, you might be covered. But if you don't pay, as he said, he would tell the Russians, quote, do whatever the hell they want. Managing alliances is not easy, but you're better to have allies than not. And the example that I think Mr. Trump never really understood was in the 20 years after 9/11, 1,000 NATO troops died in Afghanistan fighting alongside their American comrades. And they were only there because they were allies. Looking back at Mr. Trump's first term, on Ukraine, there was only one significant interaction he had on Ukraine. And that was his effort to try to persuade President Zelensky to provide some political dirt that he could use against Joe Biden and his primary candidate in the 2020 election. And he describes a perfect phone conversation where you can read the transcript of the conversation. And if you do, I defy you to find a single item of American government business that Mr. Trump was trying to do in that call. And I see no reason to believe that his views on Ukraine have changed. So if he does win, I would expect in 2025, you see an end certainly to American financial support for Ukraine. I believe Europe would continue to try to help the Ukrainians, but the problem is I don't believe that on its own Europe has the defense industrial capacity to provide what Ukraine needs. And I think there's a second question was if the United States sort of backs out, where then does the leadership come to the effort to help Ukraine? So that the end of that support, I think, would make the situation much more difficult for Ukraine and would significantly raise the prospects of a Russian victory there. I also think that an election would have very negative implications for NATO. John Bolton, who was Mr. Trump's second national security advisor, says that he will withdraw from NATO, but he doesn't even have to do that. You basically can decide to stay within NATO, but decide you're not going to really take Article 5, the article that says an attack on one is an attack against all, seriously. And if you do that, that has very negative security implications both for Europe and for the United States. So I'd make just one last observation, is I have, and I've been watching this from California, so my vision isn't all that great perhaps, but over the past 2 years, it does seem to be that there's been a recognition in Europe of the possibility that Mr. Trump could return to the White House in 2025. What I haven't seen is any serious preparation in Europe for that possibility. And it seems to me that European governments are really just hoping that the good sense of the American voter will prevail in November. But if that doesn't happen, what's the plan B? So this is going to be the most consequential American presidential election in my lifetime. And I too am very much hoping for the good sense of the American voter. But if that good sense fails, I believe that the security situation for Europe is going to become much more difficult, darker, and more dangerous. So there is a very real contrast for European security in how American voters vote in November.
Steve, wow, thank you very much. Ambassador Pifer suggesting why we may be concerned and may even begin to be somewhat alarmed later in the year. Tracey, Professor German now, perhaps you could give us your views.
Thank you. And actually, I think I'm going to pick up where you finished there about wishful thinking. and wishful thinking on the part of Europeans, Western leaders with regards to Russia. There's been far too much wishful thinking, I think, for decades. Russia will become a democracy. It will become like us. They'll change. Putin will no longer be leader. There'll be a new leader. It will all be fine. They're going to lose the war in Ukraine. And all of this is really often not grounded in reality. It's not rooted in reality. And it means that we're not fully prepared for outcomes that we don't like. And I think it's very clear that with regards to Russia, no, it's not going to suddenly, wake up one morning and go, do you know what? Democracy, that's definitely what we're after. And these leaders we've had for decades, centuries even, no, we want a big change. I think for me, and my key point here would be, we really have to stop the wishful thinking with regards to not just Russia, with many other countries out there who think differently to Western countries, and avoid complacency. Because obviously, yes, Russia had an election this year. It came as no surprise that Vladimir Putin won, with nearly 88% of the vote in his favour. His fifth term in office, he's currently 71. If he remains in power until the next term, when he would actually have to give up in 2036, he will be 83. Now, he may well still be in power then, unless something happens. If you look at the statistics, generally, that type of leader doesn't voluntarily leave. An accident befalls them, for example. They leave office, often not alive. But this shouldn't, it's not a surprise. If he sees out his fifth term, he will overtake Stalin as the longest serving Russian leader since Catherine the Great. Okay? So I think there's a lot that we really need to be thinking about rather than focusing on what could be. Since Putin came to power in 2000, he has really centralized power and authority within the Kremlin. And what I think is often overlooked is that Russia's brief flirtation with democracy and the institutions of liberal democratic rule in the 1990s led to chaos, and in the minds of many ordinary Russians are associated with instability, with chaos, and a time when pensions weren't paid, there was no money for teachers, for doctors, and there was a hankering back for stability, okay? And also a hankering for a return to Russia as a great power on the international stage. The 90s, for many ordinary Russians, I think, were seen as a brief kind of blip. But in the West, we still look back at the times that, the 1990s and Russia changing. And I think we really have to move on from that time. Steve, you talked about Biden and his election campaign back in 2020. And one of the key issues for Putin and Russia at that point was that he made democracy and democratic principles and returning those to his foreign policy, to centre of foreign policy, as a key plank of his kind of campaign, which was seen, I think, by the Kremlin as a real threat and a real problem for national security. And what we're seeing, I think, at the moment, as the Kremlin looks towards what may or may not happen in the US, whether we see Biden remain in power or we see Trump coming back in, Putin has become increasingly confident. He seems to be kind of much more forthright at the moment with regards to Ukraine, and that Russia may well achieve victory there. But he seems to be thinking that Trump may well, gain victory, and that this will, for Russia, be, well, it would be a bonus and a benefit. I think from Putin's perspective, the language that he used, as some of you may have seen, there's been an economic forum going on in St. Petersburg over the last few days, and Putin's speaking about the war, about Russia's situation, and the language he's using and the phrasing and just his tone, it's the most positive he's been for the last 2 years since they invaded Ukraine. And I think that's concerning. I think he perceives Western resolve to really be at risk at the moment. And Western unity, I think, is it's the critical vulnerability for Ukraine, really, and for continuing support for Ukraine. And I think there is a lot of concern about what's going on in elections across Europe, across the West, and what this might mean moving forwards for the war in Ukraine. From a Russian perspective, there are two wars going on in Ukraine. There is the war against Ukraine, but there is also a wider confrontation with the West, okay, the collective West, to use Russia's term. And this belief that Russia is standing up and pushing back against a West that has sought to fashion the world in its own image and to spread liberal democratic values and to remove regimes that are unfriendly. This is from a Russian perspective, obviously. And it is concerning. Gavin, you mentioned the elections in Georgia and what's been going on there. Georgia has elections in October of this year. That's Georgia in the Caucasus, to the right of Turkey, not the US Georgia. Yeah, on their voting too. But you may well have seen over the last few months there's been a lot of unrest there. They have instituted, the government in the last few weeks, a very unpopular foreign agents law, which means that organisations that receive over 20% of their funding from overseas have to register themselves as an agent of foreign influence. Now, Russia has a very similar law, as does Hungary, as do a few other states around the world that are less than liberal. And there has been a real split in the Georgian population over this, okay, and pushing for, particularly from the kind of younger members of the population, for this law not to come into being. It has, and there are real concerns what their elections are going to bring in October. And this matters. This matters because the narratives from Moscow are that the West, they're not interested in you. They're not really there for you when you need them. Yes, you've been given EU candidate status. You might become a member, but don't bet on it. We can offer you a much better deal. That message resonates with many, many countries around the world. And I know there's a panel later on today about the Global South. Very, very interesting. Russia's been very, very active across the Global South, in particular Africa, in particular countries where the Western states are withdrawing, and particularly France and French former colonies. And I think moving forwards, we should be paying far more attention to what is going on in these countries. And as I said, avoiding any form of wishful thinking with regards to what we want to happen rather than the reality on the ground. I should finish there.
Thank you very much, Tracey. Professor Germ there, and I had the pleasure of talking to a Peruvian government minister a couple of years ago and asked why, it wasn't Russia, why trade with China was so interesting to them. And he said, because they just want to give us the money and they don't bang on about human rights, unlike the terrible Americans and the terrible British and the others. Anyway, Dr. Helene von Bismarck, I think it is. Oh, Mark next.
Yes. Okay. Right, thank you. So in this year of elections, let's start off with a little bit of historical context. In the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Thucydides said in his history of the Peloponnesian War, "Right as the world goes is only in question between equals in power. While the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must." It's been used by foreign policy analysts ever since. Sum it up, big boys rules. Then somehow at the end of the last century, we thought we'd moved beyond it. Francis Fukuyama infamously said in 1992, humanity has reached the end of history. The universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. The 90s were the sort of high point of this optimism, what's called the rules-based international order, horrible phrase for the noble aspirations of the 45 UN Charter, RBIO. It was reinforced in the 90s, Fukuyama's decade, with declarations like between NATO and Russia that we would create in Europe a common space of security and stability without dividing lines or spheres of influence limiting the sovereignty of any state. So Fukuyama's suggestion now looks like extreme hubris. It is. RBIO was never universal, but in Europe we did seem to be getting to that point. But Thucydides was right, and when it all started going wrong in 2014, one of the Norwegian prime ministers said, we cannot have a world where big countries decide what to do with their neighbors. But that's precisely the world that's now looming. In our holiday from reality, we had the peace dividend, and defense spending turned into a fire sale. And now we're struggling with the enormity of the challenges facing us. And we need a new mindset. But we're still in holiday mode. We've still got sand in our sandals. On Russia, their Georgia aggression, 2008, red light, ignored. First invasion of Ukraine, 2014, woke us up, but we didn't do that much. So it emboldened Putin to have another go, 2022. And in so doing, he highlighted that accuracy of that phrase, weakness is a form of provocation. Weakness is a form of provocation. So we're returning now to Thucydides' world, but the wheel of history rolls on, so how it plays out changes. So we're now living in the era of hybrid conflict. The black and white division of war and peace was always fuzzy, but we now live in a world much more of grey zones, of a strategic composition shading into a continuum of conflict, meddling in elections through social media, information warfare, my area, cyber hacking of essential services, GPS jamming, sabotage of armaments factories in NATO countries, and more. It's happening now. We're already in the lower slopes of war. That's a hard reality we need to face up to. And remember in this, we're no longer a great power. Britain doesn't decide the fate of nations anymore. Thank God for NATO, huh? Next, as has been highlighted, Russia's not going to become a nice neighbor. Putin's worldview looks back to Russia's imperial past. Domestically, he's copying the old Tsarist ideology of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Foreign policy, more for us, he follows Catherine the Great's principle. I have no way to extend my borders, but I have no way to protect my borders, but to extend them. Meanwhile, Europe is way behind the curve on rearming and rebuilding. The risk of major conflicts closer, and preventing war requires deterrence. But deterrence requires big enough armed forces with enough equipment and enough stocks. That takes time, and we've wasted a lot. Meanwhile, China's watching, economically dominant, flexing their muscles. They have the world's largest navy. They ambition to control the South China Sea, through which much of the world's trade moves. And don't believe they wouldn't use that. They're watching us in Ukraine. If Russia wins because we fail, then the risk to Taiwan shoots up. They think they can take Taiwan with us watching on. So deterring Chinese adventurism is entwined with events in Ukraine. And they're a new element in this new world disorder. We've been comfortable with something akin to a unipolar world, with the US the dominant force in a global order that's really benefited us and our values. That's going. Some may feel that's only fair. Everyone should have their chance, but be careful what you wish for. As we move into a multipolar world of great power conflict among countries who do not share our outlook, the security environment is now contested by a mix of disruptors, emerging powers, rivalries, and terrorists. The disruptors are countries like Russia and Iran with its axis of influence, destabilizing the existing order. Emerging powers, China, India, Saudi Arabia, they feel their time has come. Now, they may not be necessarily malign or always malign, but it's their worldview they care about, not ours. And then the rivalries between Iran and Saudi Arabia, for instance, the warring parties to conflicts in places like Libya, Sudan, parts of Africa, they're backed by a mixture of disruptors and emerging powers. They're the proxies. So, and then there are old-fashioned terrorists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and now further enabled by modern technology, which is another big new thing. Once our ragtag guerrillas were armed with Kalashnikovs. They now have sea-skimming missiles, ballistic missiles, precision-guided drone swarms. Technology that was once really our prerogative, that was once the preserve of major powers, is now cheap, highly available, and extensive, and even challenges the capabilities of the US. Look what's happening in the Red Sea, where their drones are being shot down. And that highlights another security risk. Maritime choke points. Well, there are about 8 in the world, and we, the major powers, used to make sure we controlled them all because our trade depends on them. We've lost control of them now, and 5 of the 8 are vulnerable. That's your food, that's your smartphones, that's everything you need. And this spread of accessible technology isn't just weapons, but information technology, especially information technology. Smartphones, social media, AI, tools for good and ill. From a security perspective, my area, it's used for disinformation, polarization, deep fakes, general mayhem, makes it a dangerous tool for our adversaries, who are more easily able to weaponize its most alarming elements. So this is a new factor, which even Thucydides hadn't considered. So let's get back to the year of elections. It's not going well. That's been highlighted. Destabilizing toxic populism is on the rise. Across the world, including Europe, extremist parties are gaining power, and what they're espousing is not comfortable. NATO itself has some problematic governments. It's not going 100% wrong, but on balance, it's not going well. I'm not going to elaborate on Trump other than to say from a security perspective, if he gets back, the potential consequences are disastrous, potentially catastrophic. So all in all, if we're not worried, really worried, then we're either kidding ourselves or we're not paying attention. What we're mostly discussing in our current election campaign suggests we're not paying enough attention. The D-Day debate, well, the need for D-Day was a consequence of our failure to deter in the 30s. The situation is not irretrievable, but we need to take some unwelcome, necessary, painful decisions. The longer we leave it, the tougher it will be. The clock is ticking.
Thank you. That brings us to our final presentation from Dr. Helene von Bismarck. Helene.
Well, thank you, Gavin, and thank you for the invitation to the University of York to the festival. Just first, quick point of correction. I was at King's until December, and I'm now also at RUSI. I don't want to be here under false pretenses. I want to talk about 2 things today after. It's hard to be fourth after this lineup. The first one is about alliances, and the second one is about the connection between security and democracy. Starting with the alliances, I start with a little anecdote. I'm a German who thinks about Britain all day long because that's my research, that my focus is British foreign policy and British history, but I'm ultimately on the outside and I live in Germany. I come here as often as I can. And then I couldn't come here during the pandemic for 2 years. And the first time I was back was 5 weeks after Russia had invaded Ukraine, and I took part in a workshop about European security and what all this meant, this attack against Ukraine meant for all of Europe, including Britain. And I was the only non-British person in the room, and we talked about lots of things. But I remember one moment when I made a suggestion of what we should do. I used the word we. I can't even remember what I said, but there was this retired British member of the military who interjected and said, "Who's we?" And to be clear, he wasn't trying to throw me off, he wasn't being rude or anything, it was just a point of clarification. But that question really stuck with me, and I've been thinking about this ever since. Who is we? Because we've been talking about the West today, and it's quite interesting how the West as a concept has had this big renaissance since Russia invaded Ukraine. Nobody talked about the West, or just one. Well, it was, nobody was very convinced of the West anymore until this happened. And then suddenly we sort of rediscovered our unity and what we have in common. And for all our bickering and mutual recriminations on what we should all do better, actually the unity among Europeans and North Americans, let's include the Canadians in this, has been very impressive, but it's also fragile in my view. But who's the we? Who's the we, and how do we organize the we? And I think the one common denominator we have, and the most important thing, what constitutes the we is NATO, especially now that Britain has left the European Union. At this point, can I just say, today Germany is going to the polls in the European election. I'm here, and you're no longer part of this. And sorry to be partisan, but can I just say that this is really sad. Still, we have NATO, and and we need NATO, and it is absolutely the linchpin of all of our security. But NATO now sometimes feels, or might feel, a little bit wobbly because of what might happen in the United States. And I agree that you don't even have to assume that the worst case is going to happen, that Donald Trump not only wins, but just withdraws from NATO. That would be a very drastic development. But the question is, does conflict become more likely because of the things he says? So the question is not, what will America do if there is a conflict between Russia and NATO? If Russia attacks NATO, how will America react? The question is that attack becoming more likely because Trump wins the White House? And there's obviously, I don't have a vote in America, not much I can do about this. But we have to think, I'm a bit annoyed with all these people who sort of stare at America, like a rabbit looking at the snake, and I'm terrified too, I admit it, but at the same time, there are some things we can do. And the most important thing, I think, for Britain and for all Europeans is we have to really, really step up in defense spending and but also efficiency, procurement, making things faster, and acting now. The time that has already been lost. I should also at this point say, it's really important to me, there are always going to be people who call you a warmonger when you say something like this. The whole point of NATO is not just defense, it is deterrence and defense. And we can talk, I'll leave it to you guys to talk about the defense part, but the deterrence part, the whole idea is to prevent this conflict from ever happening, and for that we need to be ready. And at the same time, I would also say there's this very old debate, especially in Germany, to think about European strategic autonomy or NATO in sort of binary terms, which is very outdated in my opinion, because it's not an act of being sort of anti-American. If we do more for ourselves, it's actually an act of Atlanticism, because the best way of hedging against a Trump presidency is to step up ourselves. And also, even if Biden is an Atlanticist, and I think I agree he is, it is clear that the US is very focused on China, with reason, and that both sides of the aisle in Congress want Europe to do more. So that's something we have to do. And then getting back to the we, that brings me to the second question of how we think about security and democracy and freedom in Europe, the continent, in which I would include this country. There is, at the moment, we have a global, but especially a European, but also I would say a global crisis of security. And a very bad one in Europe was a huge war happening in Ukraine. And at the same time, we are witnessing a real crisis of liberal democracy, and it's actually most pronounced in the United States at the moment, because being worried about Trump is not a political question. It's not about certain policies one may or may not support. It is about now a convicted felon and about somebody who didn't want to accept the last election results. So this is about the future of American democracy. And NATO is an alliance for all its course, but the idea is to be an alliance of democracies, and democracies depend on consent of their electorates and of people in general. And I think in Europe, we are also having a crisis, not quite as bad, but depending on the country, but we also have a crisis of liberal democracy. And I would include this country, respectfully, in that. And it didn't start yesterday. For years now, we've seen an increased polarization, which extends far beyond the question of whether or not Britain should be in the EU. We see, also in Germany, in France, much more pronounced in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Poland, we've seen over the last few years railing against institutions, disrespect for the rule of law, a great deal of aggression in public debate, trying to scare people into silence, trying to shut people up, trying to tell somebody whose argument you didn't like, you are not just, I don't disagree with you for this reason, but you're actually a terrible, immoral person and you have no right to pronounce your views. And so this is a huge problem. It can also, I mean, there have been very encouraging moments lately, for example, in Poland, where you had a pretty populist government, which was then defeated in an election. So things can go another way. And I think, talking of wishful thinking, there is something we can do. And I think we have to massively invest in our security, and we have to massively invest in our democracy. And picking up on something which you just said, when it comes to narratives and disinformation and people abusing the most important freedom that we have to say what we think and stand up for what we want, to spread lies and destabilize and push dividing lies. I mean, we have to push back against this in the sense that we have to think about, and this is a long-term thing. I mean, it is really baffling to me, and I would include my own country in this, how little focus we put on education, on media literacy, on how, you know, this comes down to, can I trust what I see with my own eyes on the internet? Is this a lie? And this, you need, for a democracy, you need an educated population which is able to distinguish truth from lies and propaganda from fact. So I would say this crisis of, and I don't want to speak for too long, how much do I have left? The crisis of liberal democracy and the crisis of security, they reinforce each other, and that's what's so dangerous at the moment, because war in Europe leads to you know, terrible consequences on the ground in Ukraine. It also leads to an economic crisis, rise in energy prices, and so you feel this yourself. And this can lead to a situation where people will say, why would we help the, you know, this is all very sad, but the world is a very sad place. Why should we help them? We have lots of problems here. I can't get a doctor's appointment. My daughter's school is a catastrophe. People are running to food banks, so why should I care about Ukraine? But the fact is that war is going to impact us all in the end. But you're only going to convince people of that if you also really engage with their day-to-day problems. And if you have an increasingly polarized politics all over Europe, where the political discourse is somewhat detached from the material reality of the lives of lots of people, that's a really dangerous situation. And those people might then turn towards far-right populists, like we have in Germany, sadly, or in France, or now in the government in Slovakia, who tell them they don't really, you know, the institutions are not really important, the rule of law is just a cynical ploy, we don't really need this, I hear you, I hear your anger, I'm there for you. So these two things go together. One last point on the EU and on the we, and Britain and Europe. There is this view I sometimes encounter in the UK among colleagues who says, we don't really need, well, you know, yeah, Brexit is sad, or they don't find it sad, depending, but at the end of the day, we have NATO, so who needs the EU anyway when it comes to security? That is politely nonsense. Because You cannot, in an alliance of democracies, you cannot think, and at a time when war, as you said, is changing, and much more is happening in the grey, and it's not just a question of tanks crossing a border, it's a question of cyber attacks, of people undermining democracy from the outside, spreading lies, pushing unrest. At a time like this, it's not just about the hard stuff, it's also about resilience in terms of how our societies function. And for that, the EU is actually pretty important, or could be important, needs to step up. And I very much would like the UK to be part of that conversation. And we now have a situation where people, countries that used to be in the EU but not in NATO, like Sweden, have joined NATO. So for the vast part of this continent, the combination of NATO and EU is the linchpin of how they sort of position themselves internationally. In the UK, that's no longer the case. To be clear, I'm not arguing you should rejoin tomorrow. The reason why I'm not arguing this is because I know it won't happen, and I'm a realist. Doesn't mean it wouldn't be nice. But we need urgently to stop thinking in our sort of 2017-18 mindset, and I very much include the European side in this. We need the British to be part of every conversation about the future of this continent. You took yourself sort of institutionally out of many of those conversations because you're no longer in the room, and many Brits have underestimated how bad this is. That said, I would very much appeal to the European side to consider that a United Kingdom turning away from the European continent, which is what some of us worried about, not now anymore, because Ukraine has really shown how much the British actually care about Europe and how important they are in Europe. But Britain entirely turning away from Europe is very bad, I would say. For the UK, it's also really bad for Europe, and it's time that, I think, on the European side, we acknowledge that too. I'll be quiet now.
Thank you, Helene. I obviously want to throw it open to questions, but could I try to tie some of these threads together and pick up a bit of possibly slightly more cheerful news? But to use that German word that was used by the Chancellor, Zeitenwende, a turning point, are we? Everybody has sort of said, essentially, we were very complacent. We were a bit triumphalist as the West in the 90s. Unipolar world, we won the Cold War, it's all going our way. Have we got it now? In other words, in the 1930s, it took something even more horrendous than we're seeing. Have we got it now to the extent that we realize in Britain we need better relationships with Europe, that we need NATO to be invested in, that we need to spend more money on defense, and that perhaps leaving aside Trump himself, maybe we could just all go around and just think, is there some reason for optimism in saying, yeah, we got it wrong in 2008 in Georgia. We got it wrong when Estonia was cyber attacked and others even earlier. But we might get it a bit better now. Steve?
Who's the we? That's the first question. I can talk to America. And I think in America there isn't appreciate that times have very much changed, and that we have to be more realistic about the challenge that Russia poses and the challenge China poses. That, I think, is mainly at this point, though, in the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, quite frankly, is very difficult for me to recognize. And the example I will cite is on Thursday or Friday in the New York Times, Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, had an article in the op-ed in the New York Times where he wrote, "We cannot afford the mistakes of the 1930s." And I agree with much of the thrust of his op-ed. However, Mitch McConnell has also endorsed Donald Trump, who I believe his instincts are basically the instincts of the 1930s, America first, we don't have to worry about what happens in the outside world. And I think that's the problem that we're dealing with. And unfortunately, that idea, with, for lack of a better term, I refer to the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, seems to sort of share that view. And to the extent they see an outside challenge, it's China. And the idea is that Europe can handle Russia on its own, Europe has a larger economy, Europe should be able to do this. And that they don't see that there in fact is a real threat to America if a conflict breaks out here that Europe can't handle.
Tracey?
I know you're after optimism. I'm not positive on this. Have we got it? Yes, we see some very big threats. What are we doing about it? I mean, the state of UK defence and defence spending, the reports last week about the size of the army now, and this isn't just about being able to defend the UK territorially and, you know, act as a key NATO ally. This is about deterrence. And if our adversaries look at us and go, we're not so sure that actually the UK has the capabilities, that it's not a credible kind of actor in military terms, then they won't be deterred. So I think we need to do more, not just the UK. I think all European allies need to do far more in terms of defence spending, getting ammunition production up and running. We have had over 2 years to have got this right, and we're still not there. And so no.
Mark, I mean, NATO is strengthened to an extent. People have woken up to it. Although I have to say, and this is not being the cheerful one, someone formerly in MI6 said, I interviewed recently, said to me, you have to realize Russia may be the weather, but China is climate, and that's out of area. It's nothing to do particularly with NATO. Yeah. And yet that's another threat, which is a related threat.
Yeah. It's interesting in the new NATO strategic concept, they recognize China as a threat, but they don't know what to do about it.
Exactly.
And that's because, and that perhaps goes back to Helene's point about that there is a mix here, that when you're talking about defense, there's a continuum of conflict. And hard power, which is essentially NATO, is not necessarily what you need for China, or it may need to be done by a sort of an alliance of the willing. I think what we've got is a dawning of realization. NATO defense spending across it has gone up hugely. Most of the countries are now pushing at the 2% plus. But the goalposts keep moving. The military have this sort of concept of getting inside your opponent's decision-making loop. And this is that if you're at point A and you do something, and the other side is slow, by the time they react to point A, you're at point B. And now you've reacted to point A, and now you've got to react to point B, and then they're on point C, and what happens is that the world is changing faster than we're changing. So we need to catch up. And the problem, the dilemma is that the more you have to do to catch up, the more expensive it is. If we had, for instance, taking defense spending, if we had raised defense spending in 2014, when the first Russian aggression in Ukraine happened, we would not need to spend so much money now. So the problem is that the slower the dawning realization means that the catch-up has to be bigger, and if the situation or the opponent changes faster, it gets bigger and bigger. That's why I say you've got to act now, because it's not going to get better. But there is a dawning realization. Yes, there is.
And could I pick up on what's happened in Germany? Because Scholz came up with this great, Zeitenwende. We're at a turning point. He hasn't done very much. I mean, and that is not simply him. There are other politicians apparently closer to home who say things and don't actually do it. But, where's the evidence that he gets it?
Okay, we can talk about Olaf Scholz and we can talk about Germany. Has there been a Zeitenwende? Has Germany changed?
Yes, that's what I'm asking.
Well, number one, I would say absolutely. Germany has changed, but Germany has certainly not changed to the degree that would make a British or American defense expert happy. It's not enough. I would say that, on the one hand, you have had a really drastic change of the way Germany thinks and talks about war and peace, about the armed forces, about our own future, about our security. It has been, a week ago, I think, our Foreign Defense Minister Boris Pistorius gave a speech in which he said, we have to be ready for conflict by 2029. Not, I want a conflict in 2029, but there is a possibility that there might be one, so can we please get our act together? And this was sort of the fifth most important news story of the day. In Germany, I mean, 2 years ago or 5 years ago, that would have been, an unthinkable thing to say. Would have been, and now it's become very much part of the reality. So yes, there has been, and I sometimes get quite annoyed when I, as somebody who's been really pretty critical of the Scholz government, especially at the beginning of the war against Ukraine, and always said, can we please do more and quicker? And I agree, pace is key. It's all too slow. I also get really annoyed when I come to the UK and I sit in a room with lots of very clever people who I personally like and much respect and generally agree with on what needs to be done on Ukraine and NATO and defense, who then lecture me on how Germany hasn't changed at all and Germany is terrible, without a hint of self-awareness of what might have been gone wrong in this country over the last 10 years. Never mind. Anyway. And who also have now discovered populism. There might be populism in Europe, and the far right is taking over. I'm hugely concerned about this in Europe, but there is a certain irony being lectured on this by certain people in the United Kingdom. Still, but it's a very valid question. I think the point is that what we have at the moment, which I'm very critical about, is that there has been a change. There has been a significant increase in spending. It's by far not enough. Not enough at all. There are also new debates such as conscription, which again it just shows you how the conversation has changed, but again not happening fast enough. But what's worrying me at the moment is, and that brings me back to the point about the connection between democracy and security, is you had, especially last year, it's going down now, but you had the far right really surging last year and people were very concerned about this. And what you have to know about the German far right and also about the hard left is that they tend to be very accommodating to Putin's worldview, to put it mildly. And they make themselves out to be proponents of peace. So everybody who now wants to do something on defense and NATO and sort of believes in Ukraine's right to defend themselves is now painted as a warmonger, whereas these people who coincidentally sound quite like Putin are supposedly, harbingers of peace, and people buy this in some places. And that's very worrying. And I think one way of reacting to this among some politicians, and I would include the Chancellor in this lately, is to emphasize the Besonnenheit. Besonnenheit means I'm decisive, but I'm careful and I'm sensible. And that's very often the key word now when we talk about Ukraine and what we send to Ukraine. I mean, Germany is one of the most important supporters of Ukraine, both militarily and financially, a fact which has completely unnoticed in the British press. We're very much stuck in May 2022, which was 2 years ago. But still, yes, in absolute terms, there is a lot we send, but there are also things we don't send, there are things we don't do. And this is, I think, one of the reasons for this is the domestic discussion in which some politicians try to position themselves. Yes, we help the Ukrainians, but at the same time, we are obviously careful. We are not like these crazy Brits. They don't say that. But, I mean, that's what I'm hearing. I'm just a bit oversensitive. But we're not like these crazy warmongers who just want to chuck everything and, there might be nuclear war. And this is, I think, a way of how the crisis of democracy and crisis of security reinforce each other, because you're worried that people who are just terrified of war in Europe might buy what the populists are selling them. So you try to accommodate them by doing less on defense and security. And that could have really negative consequences. That is something what I'm critical about. So has Germany changed? Germany has changed. And I think that change also takes time and won't be reversed tomorrow at all. But it is, from a Ukrainian perspective, too slow, and I can also understand why many of our allies, especially in Eastern Europe, are just impatient, because while they might understand that, given our history, we have reasons how we talk about these things, and you have to take your electorate with you. When you're on the front line, you don't really have the luxury of much soul searching, so they're obviously impatient. In terms of has everybody else changed? Well, I think everybody has understood that, I mean, France has changed very considerably over the last 2 years. That's also something that's pretty underreported in Britain, because we went for a place when Macron said, let's not humiliate Russia. Now he's being much more forceful in talking about how to sort of resist Russian propaganda, how to help Ukraine. But yes, I think we can pat ourselves on the back for what has been achieved, or we can face up with how really urgent and dangerous the situation is, and I think we should do the latter.
Thank you. I think we've got some microphones. Right, we've got plenty of time now for some questions. There's a couple of gentlemen down the front, and there's somebody over there. I think maybe you can get that one.
So this has been a really, really good panel. So I agree with the statement that was made that we are currently at war, which is that of the issue of cyber warfare. And this has been going on for a while, like Stuxnet, attacking Iran, when we look at NotPetya with Russia attacking Ukraine, and then that rebounding on the US and the UK. And something that quite worries me is the fact that we don't really talk about that much in the UK. Quite literally in the last month, we've seen Santander being hacked, we've seen the BBC being hacked, we've seen hospitals. Like the other day, David Cameron got like a video call from someone pretending to be a politician, and you just wonder, when politicians in our country sometimes don't even, they can't even tell you how Wi-Fi works, their passwords are like password 123. What could be the future of our security as a country if global elections don't go the way that we want in America, especially with certain people being very close to countries that don't have our best interests in heart?
That's a very good question. I don't know. Do you want to take that? I mean, it would diminish democracy endlessly, wouldn't it, if we think that somehow our elections are being stolen, and it's already done that in the United States, and it could do the same in Europe, couldn't it?
And it's taking what is the kind of key strength of liberal democracy, its openness, its debate, it's, encouraging ranges of views, it's all of that, all of the things that we take very much for granted, I think, and turning those into a critical vulnerability and using them against us. And it is very clever, and I think we are becoming more aware of them, but I think we are, it's back to that OODA loop, and we are behind the curve. And there are adversaries out there who are far more skilled in taking these technologies and using them against us. And that point about education. I mean, quite frankly, I think I have teenage children who they spend their lives on TikTok, etc., etc. And when I suggested that TikTok might be, a challenge, or maybe what you saw on TikTok isn't necessarily the gospel truth, they look at me like, well, yeah, don't be silly. But I think it's education, it's making people aware of these things and being aware that we are vulnerable and that our societies need to be far more resilient. The attacks against the hospitals, and we were talking about this earlier, returning us to the dark age, we need to make sure we have backup systems that are able to function, so that in the event there is a hack, all power is taken down. I mean, an attack against the national grid, so we couldn't get money out, for example. Shops could no longer, we couldn't, pay. And when was the last time we all paid by cash? It was probably pre-COVID for many of us. We need to have systems that enable us to do that, because I think being aware that these kind of events are likely to increase over coming years.
Can I bring a mark on that as well? Because, 2005, Estonia's banking system was taken down after they caused a great deal of irritation to Putin and Russia. And by remarkable coincidence, the banking system was taken down. So we've had plenty of warnings about this, haven't we? And NATO's done something in Estonia about that.
Following that happened in Estonia. They set up a cyber center of excellence in Estonia, which is actually what it says on the tin, a hugely effective center for developing resilience. It's a very common phrase now among the foreign policy and the people about that you need to make resilient societies. And if we look at countries like Estonia itself, Sweden, Finland, they have a much more holistic attitude to defense. They mobilize more people, but they also have emergency conferences every year where they mobilize huge numbers of people to practice resilience against things like cyber hacking. And I mentioned hybrid warfare. And we are, as I said, we're on the lower slopes of war. And one of it is once you say we're at war, then suddenly your mindset changes. And I would say the Russians certainly think they're at war with us. Be no mistake at that. So it's time we started thinking we're at war with them. That doesn't mean we need to launch missiles. What it does mean is that we need to start thinking about the things you were highlighting, which goes under this general umbrella of resilience. And we do not have resilient societies. And none of these things are cheap. And that's the thing, is that all of them involve resources, which means they've got to come from somewhere. In the Cold War, we were very used to spending 4 to 5% of our GDP on defense. I don't want to go back there. I really don't. But if we don't do more now, we're going to end up having to spend that and more. We'll end up with a war economy, and God help us then.
And could I give a big shout out to the Finnish government, because
Yeah.
in Finland they teach media literacy in schools from the age of 5.
Yeah.
So they say, you're online, are you reading something which is utter nonsense? And what's behind this? Anyway, we could do that
Yeah,
here.
but
Yeah,
Finland is a good example to follow.
Gentleman in the blue shirt, and then the gentleman in the front.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo Professor German's note of pessimism, I'm afraid, because it seemed to me that after the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine failed to achieve its objectives, there was an assumption that the Russian war effort would quickly collapse under the weight of sanctions and Western arms. And in fact, the opposite has happened. Russia's been very successful in transforming itself into a war economy. You see pictures of huge trainloads of tanks going to the front line, while the West is still scrabbling around to find a few second-hand tanks to give to Ukraine. And the Russian people seem to be willing to accept levels of casualties that in the West would just bring the war effort to a complete halt. And we see political logjams in the US, but I think also debates in countries like Germany that are, preventing us from having a unified response. So can the panel say anything that would make me feel more optimistic?
Yeah, go on.
Well,
Go on, Steve.
A couple of comments. First of all, the trainloads of Russian tanks you see going to the front there, if you look closely, those are like T-62s. They're pulling tanks that have been sitting out in sheds or in the open fields in Siberia for 40 or 50 years, as opposed to building new tanks. I look back, I think in 2023, we in the West, were overly optimistic about Ukraine's chances with the counteroffensive. I think in 2024, though, we're now overly pessimistic about Ukraine's chances. Because, for example, if you look at what I would regard as a major indicator of Russian success, Russia today, in June of 2024, controls only a little bit more of Ukrainian territory than they did a year ago, and far less Ukrainian territory than they controlled in June of 2022. If you look at the two big victories of the last 15 months, Bakhmut in the spring of 2023, Avdiivka in February of this year, two towns that really had far more symbolic importance than strategic importance, and the Russians probably paid maybe in the tens of thousands of lives to take those things. So I think that we may be overly pessimistic. I was in Kyiv about 10 weeks ago. Ukrainians, they're worried of the war, but they're still pretty determined. They think they can win. Now, that may be overly optimistic on their part, but they still believe they can win. And so the West, my country, we failed for 6 months in terms of the arms supplies, and I think that created a much greater situation of vulnerability for the Ukrainians. But with the weapons coming in now, and then I think the Ukrainians probably have to fix their manpower issue. They need to get more people in uniform. But the determination is there. So I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic about this. And remember, at the end of the day, in order to win, Ukraine has to not lose. And that may be an easier challenge than the Russians have.
Yeah, we are in a war of attrition now.
Yeah.
And we've got to get used to the mentality that goes with a war of attrition. but also technologically, in military terms, defense has got the advantage now for various reasons, but mostly a transparent battlefield. It's going to be very hard for either the Russians to make a decisive breakthrough or the Ukrainians to make a decisive breakthrough, because basically drone warfare means that you can't mass forces to exploit any breakthrough. So you've got a very static battlefield, and at the moment it's difficult to see either side being able to be decisive and therefore to have anything other than a war of attrition.
Gentleman there. Yes, thanks for your patience. There's somebody there.
Thank you. A small question, but an important one in the issue of global security. Does Putin have anything on Trump? There are lots of theories out there.
That, you know, has been on all our minds for a long time. And if so, can we see the pictures? Yeah. No, anyway. What do you think?
Who knows? Who knows?
Putin knows and Trump knows.
Yes,
that's what I would say.
They know. And the FSB, the security services,
FSB.
know.
I would just point out that there are that Putin's people in the FSB have got stuff on Russian generals. So if they've got stuff on Russian generals, they've possibly got stuff on on their own generals.
I don't know, but yeah, it's a question that's been out there. There was a lot of talk in 2016 about 2017. Who knows? One more reason, though, not to vote for Trump in November.
Anybody else would like to speculate wildly?
Why is Trump attracted to people like Putin? Is because of his own personality type. I mean, what I do is, my job, strategic communication, is about narratives and personalities and what goes, emotions. Trump is attracted to autocrats because he likes to be an autocrat. And he also likes to do things person to person. I'll be corrected if I'm wrong. So he sees relationships very personal. He's not a democrat in that sense. Big men get together and decide the fate of the world. So naturally, he loves autocrats because that's what he sees himself as and what he wants to be. So he's drawn to Putin because of what Putin is. I don't know if you...
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But the interesting thing about him is, so I'm a big guy, I'll deal with the other big guy. He had, 3 meetings with Kim of North Korea. It didn't produce anything. His meetings with Putin, I actually think that's a really dangerous one because Putin, as a KGB officer, one of his real focuses was, how do I manipulate people? Yeah. And that's my concern about Trump, is that when Putin gets Trump into a room one-on-one, Putin is working to manipulate him, and I fear that Trump is actually susceptible to that.
Yeah, Putin knows how to manipulate.
There's a gentleman up the back, a couple of men up there, but go ahead,
Just very quickly, I have no idea, I don't know, but as a more serious point, I think what's really important is that I don't mean to dismiss the influence of the FSB or anyone, but we shouldn't just think about propaganda or people having stuff on other people. We should think about why people are attracted to these narratives and to people like that, as you said. And that is not just the case of Trump. I mean, you have this all over Europe. You have politicians who are, they might not totally agree, but this whole, you can't expect Russia to, that's basically their back. This whole big boy routine, this is appealing to lots of people. And the job of democratic politicians is to make a better offer and to make a better case and to sort of stand up for their values and to convince their electorates that this is wrong. And if they're failing, then God help us all. So I'm just saying, don't want to dismiss all this, but let's also just focus on why do people vote for populists, and not just what do the populists do.
Thank you. Gentleman up there.
Good morning. Thank you for your views. Very enlightening. My name is Charlie. I'm a former National Defense Fellow. I can't help but notice that on the media, I've seen demonstrations everywhere around the world, largely to do with Gaza. We have Houthis that are attacking shipping lanes, driving the cost up by 25% due to the routes they've taken. But I have not heard anybody address that as an issue in terms of the impact on elections that it may have, given the nature of the movements everywhere around the world and the protesting is taking place. Could you please talk to that? Thank you.
Yes, well, I know also there's going to be 2 further discussions about the Global South in particular, but is anyone who got a thought about that?
Well, in terms of I think it's just a fact that the Gaza situation has distracted attention from Ukraine. I mean, I don't think that's in any way controversial. People find it very difficult. And if you look at the attention that was given to Ukraine in before October the 7th and the attention given after October the 7th, that's just a fact. It's not controversial. It's not taking a stance. That's just a fact. I think people can get very emotional about particular issues, and that's their right. So some people, Gaza's incredibly important. It's the most important thing, and they get very angry about it, and they march about it. And in other issues, other people get very angry about them, and they march about them. There's an awful lot of things to get angry about out there. And so some of them, they get people going. But they don't, in my view, they don't need to be mutually exclusive. You can take a view on Gaza and you can take a view on Ukraine, and you don't need to have a one or the other. And I don't want to get too deep into it because it gets emotional. But I don't see, the one thing I would say very firmly, I don't see it's an alternative. You don't need to have one or the other. You can do both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time.
And on that point, can I bring in one other area which has sort of come up, but very much on the side, which is this question about China. Because there are many, many people within the US State Department in particular, and also in the British government, who think that in the long term, China is going to be a much more difficult problem than Russia. Russia is a declining power. To go back to Thucydides, he also talked about rising great powers and diminishing great powers. And we've heard the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, essentially saying there are no limits to our wonderful relationship with Russia. Do you actually believe that?
I think they have a very practical marriage of convenience at the moment. China has benefited, I think, significantly from discounted Russian oil and gas since 2022, which it needs because it's, a growing economy. And I think Russia has been very useful to test some of those Western red lines for Beijing and to see, okay, so how far can Washington be pushed, for example? What are those red lines? And I think China's position on Ukraine has been an interesting one. But I'm not sure I believe that friendship without limits. I think, if push comes to shove, Beijing will put its interests above, this strategic partnership that they have.
What would you say? And also we're slightly more all of us, and this is the we, the West, Europe and America, is slightly more interconnected with the Chinese economy, and they need us a bit.
Yeah, there's, I think, a mutual deterrence relationship between the West and China on economics.
Yeah.
And that was actually one thing that never really developed, at least between Washington and Russia, was an economic dimension of the relationship. I mean, there's $600 billion a year of trade between the United States and China, a lot of investment. And I think that induces a certain set of caution both in Beijing and Washington that there's really money at stake. And you never had that in the US-Russian relationship. But to get back to your point, yeah, I think that there are definite limits in this limitless relationship. Right. I mean, one of the things that I believe is this war and what's happened in the last 2 years is accelerating Russia's decline as a great power while China's rising. But one of the things that Russia has lost in the last 2 years is basically the European gas market. I think Russian exports of gas now to Europe are about 20% of what they were 2 years ago. The problem the Russians have is that gas comes out of northern Siberia. The pipeline structure that Russia has built moves all that gas to Europe. The alternative would be China, except they don't have the pipeline. There's a pipeline called the Power of Siberia 1, which goes from the Russian Far East to China. But then they've talked for now at least 10 years about Power of Siberia 2, which would take the gas out of northern Siberia that used to go to Europe and move it to China. And that pipeline is probably about 4,000 miles long. It will cost tens of billions of dollars. And the Russians would keep trying to tell the Chinese, well, tell you what, let's work on a project where you will finance the pipeline. And the Chinese answer says, well, no, you build the pipeline and then we'll buy the gas. And so what that means is really you're going to see natural gas, which used to be Russia's #2 export earner, that is declining now. They're having to basically shut down wells because they can't ship the gas anywhere. And that's where China could help out, and the Chinese thus far have chosen, I think, for probably economic reasons, and also they don't want to be too dependent on Russia. You know, they've decided that that's a limit they're going to apply to that relationship.
China's the ultimate wicked problem for us, because we don't need Russia.
Yeah.
We do need China. China needs us to a degree, but they actually have a very definite worldview. There was one document that came out, was leaked about what they called their fundamental problems. And one of their fundamental problems was Western democracy. and that's literally a Chinese Communist Party document, official document. So it is the ultimate wicked problem. We cannot do without them. They cannot do without us. But actually, we're in severe competition. Russia, you know, what do we need from Russia? I mean, we can even get our vodka from somewhere else.
I'm interested that the Chinese see that Western democracy is their greatest problem, because in some ways Western democracy is our own greatest problem, isn't it? Because it's not functioning very well. We've just got a couple of minutes left. The European elections this week, we touched on this a little bit. A lot of parties on the right, the far right, seem to be doing quite well. Is that a concern, and is it also a concern because some of them seem to be, as you implied, quite a bit closer to Putin's view of the world than perhaps to the traditional democracy?
Well, yes, it's a concern. You also have to, I mean, depending on the country, you have some very different contexts. I think one big concern is France, because we will see what happens, but at the moment the predictions are that Marine Le Pen is going to do very well, which is obviously bad news for Macron. I would also, but caution this a little bit in the sense that I've been speaking to some French colleagues who say that even if Le Pen is very successful in the European elections, it does not automatically translate into a great, well, it might, but it might not, in the national elections, because the European elections are also something where people vent their anger. So just see the difference between the two. In Germany, I've been extremely concerned about the success of the far right, and now more recently we also have sort of a new hard left, well, they call themselves hard left, but they're also very nationalist party, and basically I have been extremely concerned about this, and I continue to be concerned, but I'm less concerned than I was 6 months ago, and there is a very simple reason for that, and it's not just about polls and the fact that their numbers are declining. It is about the fact that we had a huge scandal in Germany in January, which then when it just became transparent how extreme some of the views espoused by the far right are, and it led to this huge wave of demonstrations all over the country against extremism, sort of in defense of our democracy. And not only was this really moving and heartening to see, it also really changed the politics, and it made the center-right politicians take more of a stand against the far right than some of them, not all of them, had done before. Because I think the biggest danger is, and looking at this sort of globally, the center-right, whether or not you are ever going to vote for them, actually play a key role in defending democracy against far-right extremism. And when faced with the choice between sort of accommodating the far-right by themselves moving more in their direction, or saying stop, actually can have a huge impact on the whole democratic system. And this scandal and then this wave of demonstrations made a lot of politicians come out much more, and not just politicians, also people I know not to care very much about politics, to just say, you know what, this is too much, and we have to all step up for democracy. So I am less concerned than I was 6 months ago, but it's obviously, I mean, we have to fight for this every day of our lives. I also would say one thing. At the moment in the British, also sometimes American press, we have all these articles about the sort of far right. I think there was one article, the Trump moment in Europe. And can I just say that 20% for the far right, I mean, that personally horrifies me, but that's not exactly the same as Trump taking over the White House, in terms of scale. Also, the far right is quite, in terms of the European Parliament, you also have to look at how it works, the Parliament works, and these national groups are all sort of far right. They don't necessarily like each other very much or cooperate very well, which is an advantage for sort of the centre. So yes, I am very concerned. We'll have to wait until tonight. But this whole, basically, all of Europe is, Trump now is an exaggeration, and I would also, beware of the self-fulfilling prophecy.
I knew we'd get to some sunshine at the end, so there's a bit of good news. Could I just thank all of you for coming here for what I think has been an extraordinary debate. Could I thank York Festival of Ideas for staging these wonderful, wonderful debates and discussions. You can catch up on many of the events on YouTube if you so wish. And just the last thing I'd like to do is thank our wonderful panel, perhaps on your behalf. Thank you. Thank you.